Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going very well. I'm excited for today's episode. We have Steve Magness coming back onto the podcast even. And Steve is going to talk to us about his new book, Win the Inside Game.
Yes, we are super jazzed to have Steve back on. If folks who've been listening to the podcast remember way back 7 years ago, him and his then co-author Brad Stulberg, co-authors on Peak Performance, were actually some of our first guests on the podcast. That was back when we were, talking to really everyone. We had a NASCAR driver, we had an NFL football player. We were really figuring out where we were going with it. And, really, really fun conversations back then, although I'm not going to, comment on what the quality of the audio or anything would be like from the old episodes if you dig back into the archives. But we were really psyched to get Steve back on to, talk about kind of like what's really changed for him over the years and, where he is now. I think even just looking at his books that he's come out with sort of since then, you actually really do see almost this evolution of, Peak Performance. Well, I still highly recommend it. It's still a great book. It's very like, go, 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 achieve, achieve, achieve. And I would say Win the Inside Game is much, we're getting a little deeper.
It's a little more zen.
We're past the, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're now into, self-actualization at the top.
Sure.
We're going up the pyramid. Super interesting book and really fun to get to chat with Steve about all things, including the hot button issue that I wait till the very end to bring up because, frankly, I was ready to start a fight with him and I didn't want to begin on a rough note, but just wait for it at the end.
Okay. So we do have a book to give away. This is Steve's book, as a matter of fact, Win the Inside Game. And so, Molly, would someone perhaps win a copy? And we'll send this copy that I'm holding to them. How would they do that?
Yeah, so you can share any post about the episode on Instagram. You can go over to Instagram and just grab our own post and put it in your stories, tag us, or share, a moment from it that you found particularly compelling. Tag us in it, or you can rate and review on wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple, Spotify, whatever, and just send us a screenshot. Either find us on the contact on our site or hit us up on Instagram in our DMs.
Sure. Or info@Consummate Athlete if you can spell it.
Or that, yeah, if you can spell it. And we'll announce a winner of that. And you know what? Let's throw in a copy of our book, Becoming a Consummate Athlete.
Oh, prize pack even.
Prize pack.
Okay.
Yeah, and you know what? Frankly, if we get a lot of entries, I got a lot of books, so we might have a couple more going out in the mail.
There you go. Share these up. So yeah, it's a fantastic episode. We were very happy to have Steve on, and very fortunate as a very experienced coach. I love he has a couple podcasts that he works on, so I'll link to all those in the show notes as well. If you want to sort of take those in from more of a coaching perspective, but certainly there's athletes that are keen as well, and then we'll certainly link to all these books and past podcasts as well.
Perfect. All right. Without further ado, let's get into this episode with Steve Magness about how to win the inside game.
All right. Well, we're back again with Steve Magness. We're very excited. Running coach, author, so many other things. But 7 years between past episodes, we had him on with Brad Stulberg after their book Peak Performance 7 years ago. And we have him back for his latest book. Welcome back, Steve.
Thanks for having me. It's been way too long. And it's kind of crazy we've both been at this for this long, but here we are.
Yeah, I think that's actually like deserving of a round of applause between the writing and the podcasting and everything that we've all been up to.
Yeah, we haven't all been replaced by AI yet and all these writing and coaching things. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, in the world of social media and internet, to do anything for 7 years is a good accomplishment. So I think pat on the back is deserved.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the first thing we actually wanted to start with was, 7 years ago, you and Brad were on talking about Peak Performance, which, book kind of took the performance, both like the sport and I guess like business world kind of by storm a little bit back then. So, looking back, that one, obviously Peak Performance feels very like externally driven. And then, your writing has really
evolved and shifted a bit in especially with this new book. So talk to us about how this mindset shift has happened. Like I know it's not completely different, but it's definitely an evolution.
I think what it speaks to is our different places in where we're at in life. And if you look at 7 years ago, which means Brad and I started writing the book 10 years ago, I'm 40 now. Back then I was 30, single, no kids, not married, like driven towards things that, seem to matter at that time, right? Performance, looking at how do we get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better, still competing as an athlete or at least training at a high level. And you look 10 years down the line, I think what changes is your perspective. Is life starts to get a little fuller, right? You realize that maybe some of the narrowness of your youth might have helped you perform well to a degree, but also might have taken you down some missteps. And I like to think that hopefully 7 years after peak performance, what I'm moving towards more is not saying that anything is wrong with that approach or that book. It has a time and a place. And a lot of people find it helpful. And I still stand by everything we wrote in it. But we're supposed to evolve and develop in our thinking. And if we don't, we're not accumulating that wisdom. So I hope that, in another 7 years, we're having this conversation on something else where I'm looking back at this book and being like, yeah, it was great. I agree. I think for the time and place, it was what I needed. But hopefully I'm 7 years older, wiser, and the same with you guys, so we can have a more nuanced and in-depth discussion on topics.
Mm-hmm. I would say, and certainly in the last 7 years, the world of sporting, if not the world, has also adapted to include as per the name of your book, win the inside game. The inside game has become more of a concept that they say, it's the next frontier. It's the key. It's 90% mental. It's all these words, towards that direction. So that's, I think, evolved maybe in the last 7 years as well, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think part of it is that like we're really good at measuring the external, right? You can look at outcomes. If we look at running, you can say, okay, how does this translate to a faster workout or a faster mile or a faster marathon? And you can do all this stuff. But like the mental side of it is so kind of still a black box to a degree. Even if you look at the latest like psychology and neuroscience, the researchers will tell you like, this is our theory. This is what we think, but like it's not as easy to figure out and test and all of that stuff. So I really do think that, as humans, we kind of go to the new frontiers. And when it comes to performance, I think the mental side, the inside game is like that frontier that is like, hey, we haven't tapped out on that. On the running side, for instance, if I was asking just about any legitimate coach how to run a marathon, we might have different programs. We probably will, but 90% of the stuff is going to be the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we have a good idea of like, this is generally what works for most people. On the mental side, it's not there. We don't have that full complexity yet. And we're still trying to like explore and understand it.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think it's a good thing that it's not measurable? Because as I'm thinking through this, I'm like, oh no, but if it all becomes measurable, does that all turn into now it's like this external driver to it? Now we're all just trying to like hit that mark and like get this brain thing going off and whatever.
There's a term in psychology. I'm going to mess this up, but basically a theory that says like once a measure, like once we start aiming for a measure, it stops being a good measure for the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, it's Goodhart's law. Yeah.
That's your like favorite thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. Thanks for the assist there.
No,
but
it's been in cycling we have it right because we have all our FTPs. Not that you
yeah.
guys don't have paces and everything else, but yeah, cycling is very bad for metrics that are external. And yes, we can. But I'd push back that we can measure them, but you guys actually talked about on one of your recent podcasts this idea that like two athletes could go running beside each other or riding beside each other, same FTP, same pace, whatever, but then they don't race at the same level, right? So even though we can measure it, it doesn't give us the answer for race day, right?
Exactly. And that's coaching 101. That's what you realize in coaching is like, oh, the the programs that I was taught to write aren't mathematical, right? When I get in the real world,
Yeah.
even if they did the same workout and are running the same stuff, like it doesn't translate exactly. And I think that's what makes it interesting. And I think to come back to the broader point is that as humans, like wrestling with that nuance is really important, and it's what keeps us engaged. And to come back to that measuring part, I mean, there's been a recent uptick of this. It's actually some research on it. For instance, when we measure something that we know is good, like sleep quality or sleep hours, for many, if you start measuring that consistently, it creates anxiety around sleep, and your sleep gets worse. Not for everyone, but for many people. And I've
Hmm.
seen the same thing happen, whether we're talking about cycling or running performance, is GPS watches that tell us our heart rate and all this stuff, or cycling power meters, like great, the information is useful. But I've literally seen elite athletes in the middle of like a tempo workout. They look down, they see their power is a little bit less or their pace is a little bit slower than what they expected. And you can see it in their face, like their eyes
Yeah.
kind of get bright, and then they're just catastrophizing. And it goes from, hey, this was going to be a B workout, maybe a C plus, but you're going to be okay. It's not a workout, but you're going to be okay. But it goes from that B workout to F
Yeah.
because the data
100%.
coming in creates that anxiety, and then it's catastrophizing and we're done.
Yeah, I think the best thing for performance is a power meter that reads about 20 watts high. Yeah, it's like the best thing. You just always start feeling great. It's just always a good day.
You laugh about this, but some of my favorite studies are come from exercise physiologists that manipulate that.
Mm,
So they'll literally give the wrong power meter or the wrong pace
yep.
to convince people that they're running faster. And what ends up happening, and they've done the same thing in strength training, like they'll change the labels of the weights, right? What ends up happening is, as long as it's like within the realm of possibility, so it's like 20 instead of 100, you generally perform better, and your mood follows that expectation.
Hmm.
So you start thinking like, oh, I'm having a great workout, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. And then that momentum builds. And it's one of the reasons from this research that we know that, like, you know, expectations, the information coming back to us, all of that from a mental side impacts what we're physically capable of. So if we can harness that in maybe a less manipulative way, we might be able to perform better.
So we shouldn't just lie to ourselves at all times, is really what I'm hearing here. Just placebo affect myself into any and every part of my life.
There's probably a balance to be had there.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm wondering, in that direction, you talk in the book a bit about setting up an environment, and that's something that I really like. I do bike skills coaching, and so a lot of it is, in my view, like setting up the right environment for the learning of the skill and that sort of stuff. But I'm wondering if, as we're speaking towards this, environment that we're setting up for athletes to do well rather than crumbling because of their watch. Do you want to tell us a bit about that and how that relates to the inside game when we're thinking about environment?
Yeah, I love this research because it's something that we often don't think about, and we just kind of take it for granted. But the environment around us has a big impact on our performance in a variety of things. So in sport, we're used to thinking of, especially in team sports, like the home field advantage. And what research tends to show is that happens for a variety of reasons, but in team sports, you generally see a both psychological and biological reaction, meaning biologically, you're more likely to have what we call a challenge response instead of a threat response when you play at home, which means you have a slightly more increase in testosterone instead of cortisol for your stress response. Testosterone tends to make us a little more confident, aggressive. Cortisol tends to push us towards like avoidance and like protection. Simplifying a bit, but it does the job. And what research has found is that it's tied to this concept we call psychological ownership, meaning when we're playing at home, we feel like it's our place. And when we feel comfortable in the place we're performing, we tend to approach instead of avoid. And what's fascinating is this is seen not just in sport, but around everything. So some wonderful research in looking at classrooms in school. There's a reason that elementary school teachers decorate the hell out of their classroom, because research tells us that like when it feels personal, kids perform better.
And or you're my mom and you're just excessive
you're
about
addicted to arts and crafts. Yeah. But maybe they found their environment that allowed them to put arts and crafts in.
Okay. Yeah. But like the point is, and again, I could go on and on about this because it's so fascinating, but in the workplace, for instance, if you have pictures of your family, you tend to perform better, have less burnout, and are less unethical, meaning you're not going to like cook the books. Why? Because
your kids are looking at you.
Yeah, your kids are looking at you. And what that does is it's fascinating. It sends a message that your environment sends a message of who you should be and what role you should play, right? And if your kids are looking at you, you are the provider, the caretaker, like that matters more than like, you know, getting the edge to whatever in work. And I think coming back to the sporting environment, what all that means is, okay, what does that mean for performance? It means we want an environment that invites roles that help us be a happy, healthy, productive, high-performing, you know, athlete or adult. And those things are pretty straightforward. We want to be in an environment where we're excited to show up. This is why having good teammates or training partners or what have you are really important, because again, what psychology research tells us is that motivation is contagious. So if we show up to practice or, you know, run club or whatever have you, and we've got a bunch of other people who are excited about the workout and getting better, even if we were a little like, oh, I really don't want to do this threshold workout today, we show up around others who are excited, we're going to automatically get excited for the challenge. Mm-hmm. So it's having others around you. And the same has been shown for a coach as well. So in some fascinating work, again, in team sports, but if a coach is losing their shit on the sideline, the players on the field report feeling more anxiety, more stress, and perform worse. And again, there's a biological component to it too. Their stress response changes. So holistically, the message is pretty simple. Your environment matters a whole heck of a lot more than we realize. So from coach to athlete to objects and surroundings, like have it invite the kind of motivation and roles that you need to occupy to perform at a high level.
And I would imagine, as you say, it's in team sports, but I would think that coach to athlete would be magnified in a running, track and field, cycling, where it's more of an individual, where it's like, oh, my coach is a nutball. It's so embarrassing. Or like, I'm going to get the full wrath of this person's, you know, anger here later or something that you could definitely see.
Not just mad at the team, mad at
you.
Versus
like, I'm a 300-pound football player. I don't really care what this little guy's going to He's just stamping his feet. Yeah.
But so here's the funny part, and this is where it's we'll just nerd out on the details here, but not an individual sport, but there was a wonderful study out of Australia, I believe it was, on professional rugby players. And after a loss, they stuck them down in a room, the players in a room, and went over what they did wrong, which is a really threatening environment, right? Which kind of sucks. It's in our sports, it's the equivalent of like your coach right after you finish the race telling you like every single thing that you messed up on. It sucks, right? You don't feel good. But these researchers did two things. First, they had either a stranger or a friend, you know, do it. Not surprisingly, when a friend did it, we handled it well or better. And we didn't see as big of an increase in that stress hormone cortisol. So you want a friend or someone you're comfortable with telling you what you did wrong. But more interestingly, I think, is to your point that you just touched on, is the bigger the size of the person, the more it impacted their stress hormones, the cortisol.
Oh, wow.
So if
Okay.
you were getting reamed out by a 300-pound lineman, you're gonna feel stressed to the max. If it was like,
One
skinny
of us.
endurance, yeah, one of us, endurance athlete, you're not going to feel as threatened
Oh,
and
okay. Okay.
stressed.
Okay.
So, I don't know what the message there is, but like, maybe if you're going to get critiqued, have the endurance athlete do it, not the football player.
Yeah, or at least like sit the football player like down in like
Right.
a really big chair or something so they appear smaller. I don't know.
Mm.
Right. Minimize but it all comes back to like, ancient stuff that we're kind of, used to, which is like, is this person threatening, or are they like trying to help and on my side and trying to help me get better? And
Mhm.
if your brain just identifies them as threatening, it's really hard to get out of this. This is why, to bring it full circle, the coach athlete relationship is so important, because if you have that trust and that belonging, that sense of connection with the coach, then they can criticize you without you feeling like the full force of the threat. But if
Mhm.
you're afraid of that coach, then like even the slightest hint will send you spiraling. And again, what research shows you is it's not just like after the performance, that lingers for days, even up to a week later. So if you've got another race, coming up the next week, like you're going to be in a bad spot just based on like, what that coach said negatively after your current one.
Mhm. Well, it's funny because that's like such a big dog training thing is like the, negative reinforcement versus positive reinforcement. And I feel like that's something that we've known about for like a fair number of years now. And that's almost like kind of common dog training knowledge. But like for some reason, it hasn't occurred to a lot of people to apply it to coaching humans. And it seems fairly obvious when you put it like that.
Mm.
I think we could learn a lot from good dog training, because it's responsive. But to answer your question, I think to why, I think it's pretty simple. It's that when you're the coach in that moment, you're frustrated too, because you're sitting there watching the athlete. You spend a lot of time working with them and getting to this point, often like months of building up, and things didn't go well. And often as a coach, you feel that emotion as well, maybe not as much as the athlete, but you still feel it. And the getting angry at someone else is externalizing it so you don't have to deal with it,
Hmm.
because it's almost like temporarily relieving to, be the football coach yelling at his players, because like it shifts the blame somewhere else and says, oh, I've done something about it. I yelled at my quarterback or whatever have you, so that next time this won't happen. Where the hardest thing to do, and I remember this, especially coaching college athletes, is sometimes, after a bad race, I'd feel it and I'd be like, they're coming off the track. I got to just like push that down, like be there for them and focus on what gets them in the right place. Like what I feel right now doesn't matter. I'll deal with that later, because like you're going to either set them up for, boosting them or pushing them down a dark hole that'll be hard to get out of later.
Hmm. I love that. Now, I really want to hear you kind of transfer this to maybe even like the self-talk perspective, because not everyone listening has a coach or works with a coach. I mean, some of them do, but they work with these great positive coaches like yourself and Peter. But for someone who's maybe had a bad workout or a bad race, I think most of us have that 300-pound coach in our heads that's screaming at us and listing out all of the things that we did wrong. And I think your book really serves to address that. So, talk us through how this applies like internally.
Yeah. So first off, I think it's really important to know that this occurs to everyone. So often it feels like it's just us.
Hmm.
But I remember, a couple years ago sitting down with, I was with a collection of, elite world class US marathoners. And I just asked them all, I said, you know, In the middle of the race, have you ever thought about ducking into the porta pot or like stepping on the curb to twist your ankle or whatever? And every single one of them, hand goes up and like, yeah, like that thought comes across basically every race. There's a point where negativity just takes over. So I think number one is accepting that that is part of being human. And the reason it is because our brain is simply trying to protect us. When we're doing an endurance activity, whether cycling, swimming, running, whatever have you, is we're pushing the bounds of what is possible. And our brain, we know this from the latest research, is predictive. So what that means is when they're in the middle of the hard part of that race or workout or what have you, it's saying, how in the world am I going to make it to this end of this workout or finish line or what have you, or even after a workout? Your brain goes, how in the world am I going to be able to accomplish this marathon or this whatever long cycling race? I just can't do it. And your brain is keeping a little doubt there because it wants you to essentially, it wants to protect itself from going too hard to the well. So that's number one, is understand why it's occurring. And then I think the second part is understand, okay, what can I do about it? And there's a couple different tactics that I think work well. First off is like changing your focus and your attention. So when we're in kind of a negative spiral, our attention narrows on that negative, and we are literally blinded to see anything that validates that negativity, right? So if your workout goes poorly, your mind just starts going through like, well, last week, I didn't have a good workout either, or, I only got 4 hours of sleep and blah, blah, blah. You just see all the negatives everywhere. The good thing is we have control of our attention and focus. So the first step is often like zooming out, shifting your perspective, and giving your mind something else to focus on besides that negativity spiral. So whether that's, what's coming up in terms of your workouts or races or what have you, whether that's even using some sort of like temporary distraction technique, which says, okay, like I get it, I'm in the doldrums, but I'm going to think about, that TV show I was watching, whatever have you. Anything that you can shift your attention to will increase the value of that thing and decrease whatever you were focused on in the past. And then
just picturing Peter just like, what is happening on Yellowstone? Honestly, this makes no sense.
but distraction is like it doesn't work over long haul, but it works temporarily when you're going through something difficult. Okay. Mm-hmm. This is why if we look at some of the research on elite marathoners, what they find different than like intermediate and novice is elite marathoners are experts at what we call like bouncing around. So they'll go from like internal focus to external focus, from locked in to distracted. Basically, whatever the moment is calling, they'll kind of shift around. Other people tend to get stuck, right? If you're distracted, you're just going to try and be distracted for the whole race. And it doesn't work because eventually that strategy is going to fail, right? So you want to become an expert at shifting your attention, essentially. And then the other thing is we can impact how we talk to ourselves. So there's this wonderful research that essentially shows that our negative talk essentially feels overwhelming because it becomes so narrow and feels like attached to us. So it feels personal, right? And when we talk negatively, we often do it in, like, I feel like this. Why do I feel bad, etc. When we create distance, we can do it with our talking. We can say, Steve, you're okay. Because when we say it, it sounds weird, but when we say our name, our brain interprets it just a little bit differently and says, hey, this isn't how I'm used to talking to myself. Like, this is a different voice. And because it's a different voice, it like interrupts that segment just a little bit. So sometimes just changing how you're talking to you in terms of first person, second person, or third person goes a long way towards creating that distance. And the last thing I'll say on self-talk is a lot of times people think like, oh, I've got to counter and always be positive. As we talked about, if you're set yourself up for like, I'm only going to have positive thoughts, you're going to fail because those negative thoughts are going to come. So the best way to deal with that is accept and then create a little bit distance and then give yourself some evidence, right? If you're feeling like trash, halfway through the marathon, be like, you know what? The last marathon I felt, I didn't feel very good at mile 14, but I came out of it. And you give yourself evidence for it's like, this is normal. It will be okay.
Do you give athletes like mantras or like self-talk? Like, are you prepared with the self-talk, or do you just sort of, do you find that people sort of, as you say, pick evidence from the past, or how do you handle that?
I think it's a skill. And like any skill, we need to practice it in practice. So what I actually do is I talked about elite athletes shifting. Same goes with self-talk is we'll try different self-talk strategies during different hard workouts. And I'll just be like, hey, today we're gonna pick a mantra and we're gonna focus on these words. Uh, Today we're gonna use, third person instead of first person. Today we're gonna look at, I want you to think of things that worked in the past in terms of like the workouts you did, the races you did, etc., to remind yourself during the thing. Today we're going to shift our self-talk from being me focused to I want you to shift your perspective to the group, right? Or the team. And you just give them the different skills there. And sometimes I'll say this as well as, and there's some research behind this, sometimes like literally internally cussing yourself out works as well. Why? If you do it all the time, it does not work. But if you do it selectively, it does, because it's often a disruptor. Because normally, if you don't internally cuss yourself out, maybe you're not David Goggins. If you don't do that normally, if you do it occasionally, your brain's like, hey, wait a minute. Like, where'd that come from? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And all you're doing is shifting that perspective. So to answer your question, we practice it in practice. And the goal is to get a diverse array of skills so that during the race, like you can pull on these different skills that you practiced and have some comfort with them versus saying, hey, I'm only going to stick to this mantra. And if this mantra fails, then I'm just like, well, where do I go now?
Just taking a quick break from today's episode to talk up our favorite sponsor, Payable Apps. So if you're looking for a very easy way to take payments online, you can do it in a Google form using the Payable add-on. It makes everything so much simpler.
We've used it for things like our jersey orders. We've used it for clinics and different camps. And we have teacher friends who have used it for pizza days and different trips that they've gone on as well. And for a limited time, you can use our link, payableapps.com/athlete, to pay no app fees for 6 months. Plus, for a limited time, new users who use Square can save $200 on the Square app fees.
So try it out for your next event, pizza day, jersey order, or clinic, camp, whatever you need to take payments for. Check it out. Again, payableapps.com/athlete. Now, back to the episode.
Yeah, and it strikes me, it probably relates to the environment. I do like that idea, and I took notes here about sort of like including that as part of, an interval session or a workout or a practice. I think is really smart, and I could see that working really well. The other thing I find is a lot of times athletes will, if their training doesn't match the competition, they're going to find themselves in a situation where they've never been. But if you've run vigorously, with your teammates, you've probably felt poor while someone else was, pulling away, and then you've dealt with that for better or worse, right? And so sometimes I find the training, if it's good training, sometimes it solves some of these things just naturally by being in the training. Do you think that that's fair? Like, I don't know if you would see that in the school environment, some of the environments you've worked in, but I know you've worked with marathoners and stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's spot on because, again, I come back to this. If you learn nothing else from this podcast, it's this. The brain is predictive. And if it's been there before and has some semblance of where it could go based on that, you're going to be in a better spot. So if you've done it in training and you've seen someone, a teammate or whatever, have you pull away and you've still figured it out, then when a competitor maybe pulls away, you're not going to go from 100 to 0 and freak out and lose it because you've been in that spot before. So much of mental training is essentially giving your brain enough evidence and experiences so that it knows like, hey, I don't have to lose my mind and freak out because I've been in a similar spot before. And then the other part of it is like in those experiences, and this is where practice and training comes in, is like having the ability to switch information sources so that you're giving yourself, like you're reinforcing the good behavior essentially of this instead of reinforcing the like spiraling negativity, like I'm not going to be able to get through this.
And I think even being cognizant of the predictive patterning like makes you more aware of that, and like it makes it much easier to do. I loved in the book the one mention you had when you're talking about the predictive stuff, the guy who had the nail through his shoe and was taken to the ER as though he actually had a nail in his foot and was in pain as though he had a nail in his foot. And it was not in his foot, as it turned out. And I started laughing. Like I was reading that, and I was like, yeah, that tracks. I would probably have responded the exact same way.
I love that example because it just illustrates it perfectly. But that's how our brain works. Like, think of that situation. Like, guy, essentially a worker builder, steps on it, a nail goes through his boot, and if that happened to you or I, what would our reaction be? We would see the nail enter our boot and be like, "Oh my God," and we'd lose it. And that's exactly what happened, even if it didn't. And the reason that occurs is simple, is because, again, I talked about what information are you consuming. In that instance, our brain literally says, hey, I just saw the nail go into the boot. My foot is in the boot. That means I should feel pain. And what our brain does is it literally turns down the contrasting information, which is your foot not having been impaled. It just turns it down. So we ignore it because it says this information is more powerful over here. So when we look at elite performance or performance in anything, it's the same deal, right? You're going to see, feel, experience different things. And you just want to make sure that like you're giving yourself information that helps you accomplish that goal versus, thinking that your foot got impaled and you're out of it. By the way, there's one other thing that illustrates this really well. Is I have a toddler, a 1.5-year-old, and a couple months ago there's this trend on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, where essentially you take your toddler near a door or near a wall, and then you like hit the wall with your hand, and they hear the noise. And what happens is your toddler will look at you, and if you grab their head, they'll start crying as if they hit their head, even though you were just banging on the head or banging on the wall. And it happens. Like lots of people did it on social media. I tested it with our toddler. She was fine. I didn't actually hit her head, but she cried. Why? Because think of the information. She hears the noise. She sees the trusted person, dad or mom, grab their head as if it was got hit. So instead of trusting her own internal sensations of my head doesn't hurt, she trusted the external ones. And that's just another great example of like, it's how it works for a toddler. It's how it works for us. Is we're just trying to make sense of the world. And for winning the inside game, the better we can give ourselves good information sources that allow us to handle things, the better off we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then it's like the opposite is true with kids too, right? Like if they fall and they like look like they're about to cry, if you're like, you're okay, you're great, everything's great, they tend to like, okay, yeah, I am great, everything's fine. But if you're like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Then it's just waterworks. We've realized this with our niece for sure.
Yeah, I've seen the exact same thing. That's what you have to realize. You're like, okay, everything's all right. But again, like toddlers do it, but we do it too. And there's so much research both in schooling and sport and teaching that essentially shows that like part of our information source is like looking externally to see how should I react to this thing. So when you're running that interval, think about it from a coaching standpoint, is if an athlete comes in, finishes that interval, and they look at you and you're like angry or losing it, they're gonna be like that toddler, right? They're gonna be like, oh, this was bad. I disappointed coach. Like, I'm gonna shut down. So much of this is like what information are you conveying to get, in the right space?
Oh my God, at Leadville, you treated me like a toddler when I came in with my ankle, and you're like, "You're okay, keep going,
So
keep
Molly,
going."
long story short, Molly didn't finish the Leadville 100 this year, but at or 40 miles, she blew her ankle pretty bad. And I was like, that's really bad. And then I was like, you should just keep going. That'll be a great idea. It didn't work out. Great.
Didn't work, but we tried.
She
And
tried. She did get 12 miles on a pretty, messed up ankle. So it worked for as long as it was going to work.
it could have gone great. You never like it could have been fine.
It makes me wonder here. So you did sort of edge that way with expectations. They say expectations minus reality is happiness or something to that effect. An athlete's out. I use power. You'd probably have pace or something like this, where, the athlete's expecting, 4-minute miles and they're running 4:10s, and the world's over. They give up on the sport. They're done. They suck. And so how do you handle that, right? Like, what's the inside game? What's the coaching strategy there to keep the athlete like within like this, keeping going, keeping at it?
Yeah. So there's two different things that I'd say here is this is why goals, expectations are good, but they need to be diverse. So if your only expectation going into a race is I need to run this pace or be at this power meter, you're probably going to be screwed. Because unless it goes perfectly and you're hitting those things, the moment it goes haywire and you're a little slow, your brain is going to panic and go, this doesn't hit expectations, like pull the plug, this isn't worth it. So we need a diversity. This is why you often see athletes have like A, B, and C goals, right? And I often like to frame it as like, yeah, we have our, best of all time, our PR, but we also have like raising the floor. So if we're like consistently good enough in our races, that increases the surface area to have luck that when the day aligns and we're really good, we're going to be that much better. And then I think the other part of that is really important on expectations is, are you solely focused on outcome or performance goals, or do you have some sort of process orientation or process goal? And not too surprisingly, what research tells us, there was a big meta-analysis that came out maybe a year ago on this, is that process goals tend to work better over the long haul. And the reason, even when we look at overall performance, and the reason is pretty simple, is because it doesn't have the downfall of pushing us towards that spiraling if we're not getting there, because the process things are things in your control, right? I want to, go at this effort, or my goal is to, negative split this race or whatever have you. It's something that's relatively more in control than just saying like, I'm going to run this pace and run this, try and hit this performance. And what research tends to show us in psychology is that process goals activate more of our approach motivation. So we see things as a challenge. Well, performance goals activate both of our approach and our avoidance motivation. In which way we go depends on which way the performance is going. So if we're getting a lot of momentum, performance goals can be great because it's just saying, hey, approach, challenge, because all the feedback coming in is telling us we got a shot. But if that momentum stalls and we start going the other way, then it stops activating the approach side and just goes defaults avoidance. So, expectations are really important, but I would say diversify them and then make sure, I'm not saying like don't have any performance goals, but I'm saying make sure there's some sort of strong process orientation there too when it comes to your races, because those are things that you can fall back on even if the performance isn't there.
I love it. Now, what happens like if you don't get the goal? Talk me through like I know non-attachment was one of the big things in the book, and I really did want to touch on that before we run out of time. So talk to me about like how you can like go for one of these goals, have these, whether it's process or performance, not get them and be okay with it, but also live to set another thing instead of just, throwing your bike in the river or something.
Yeah, so this was one of my favorite parts to study and interview people about, because it's like the central contrast of, or paradox of, performing at a high level, which is we need to care deeply about it. But if we care so much that there's like no space between us and the thing that we're essentially attached, it gets in the way. And the reason is pretty simple. If we care so much that this is the be all end all, we went, all in and burned all the boats behind us to do this thing, we're more likely to experience that kind of threat response, because it is literally either win or like big loss and failure. And that failure isn't a reflection of us doing the thing. It is a reflection of us ourselves when there's no space in between it. So it's I am a failure versus like I failed at this race, right? I am a failure is a whole hell of a lot harder to get over. So I think step one, as you hinted there for non-attachment, is you've got to be able to care about the thing, obviously, but you've got to have just enough space between you and the thing so that you can see the thing clearly. It's still going to hurt when you mess up, lose, fail, whatever you want to call it. But you're in a spot where it isn't threatening and deeply like hitting your sense of self. So what does that mean? How do we set ourselves up to that? I think first, practicing all sorts of non-attachment, whether we look at, from Eastern religions, even some Western religions have them, as well as just teaching us to have a little space between that. The second thing that I think really matters is what I'll call diversifying your sources of meaning. Meaning, what we've learned in psychology is that some of these foundational psychological needs are substitutable. Meaning, if we get a degree of like feeling like we're competent and working towards mastery in our sport, that's great. But if we also get that from our work or our parenting or our hobbies, guess what? When our sport isn't going so bad, it might feel a little bit bad, but we still have other areas in our life that are fulfilling that. So it's not like we go from 0 to 100. It's more like, or 100 to 0, it's like 100 to 70, right? We're still passing because we have this support around here. Actually, funny story. This one wasn't in the book, but years ago, I was too, young to notice the importance of this. But I got to talk to a world-class sports psychologist who was working with a lot of professional athletes. And I was in my early 20s in college, still competing. And he was like telling me about this, world-class Olympic level, one of the best in the world runner. And he goes, Steve, do you know what made the difference, allowed her to like handle that level and jump to that level? I had no idea. Training? Did she run more? Blah, blah, blah. And he looks at me and he says, knitting. And I'm like, knitting? What are you talking about? It's like her whole life was running and she had 0 hobbies until I convinced her to take up knitting. And she enjoyed it, joined a knitting group, started to have sell things at craft festivals. And she was still dedicated to running, but she had this other thing in her life. And that's when her running took off. Mm-hmm. And I didn't buy it as a 20-something-year-old because I was dumb. But I buy it now based on like the research and talking and working with elite athletes, is that you need other things in your life to kind of, build robustness so that you aren't fragile if, you lose the bike race.
Well, it's so funny. We always joke that's why so many elite women athletes have cracked this code much younger than most of the men. And that's why they all have PhDs. Yeah. Like if you look at the Women's World Tour Peloton, I think it's like 50% of them have advanced degrees. It's ridiculous.
And I've seen that as well in running as well, as you see a lot that have advanced degrees. And then the other part of it is you see a lot of successful, especially on the marathon in the US, a lot of really successful moms and parents who have gone through childhood, childbirth, and have kids, came back to the sport and are competing at a really high level, even though they have like really full lives of, a full-time job running at a high level and, caring for family and kids. And I think whether that's jobs, hobbies, academics, kids, family, whatever it is, like we got to have something else in there because inevitably our sport is going to go rough for a period of time. And if it's the only thing, if it's like your entire world, when it goes rough, it feels devastating. If it goes rough and you have other things, it still hurts, but you can deal with it and you can right the ship because you have these other things in your life to focus on and like get you out of that rut.
Mm-hmm. I like that. And I think it's funny because I feel like in sport, we're almost told that it's wrong to not have a devastated response to not getting your goal. Like it's almost like weird if someone is like okay with, when they don't have a good race. And I think it's like, no, maybe that's actually healthy. Like maybe it's okay to be sad, but also not have it be like life altering.
Uh, and there's research behind this. Again, I'm like the science nerd, so I
I
go here
love it.
too far. But what the science shows is if we have that devastating loss, again, think of your brain as predictive. Okay, what are you internalizing so that next race your brain remembers? It goes, oh shit, like that loss felt so bad. And if you're remembering how bad that loss felt going into your next one, is that putting you in a good place to perform? Like you're not ready to take it on because your brain's going to be like, I'm going to be a little more cautious because like I don't want to feel that way again, right?
Mm.
So and there's research that shows like when we have that devastating experience, what happens is we tend to like internalize it and linger on it. So the best advice I give to people is like, hey, you're gonna feel what you're gonna feel. If you feel devastating, like we can work on that, but it might happen. If you feel kind of mildly upset, that doesn't mean you don't care. It just means like you're probably handling things and have a way to handle things and process things. You're gonna feel what you're gonna feel, but then like figure out how to get back on the horse, right? And that's the name of the game when we're looking at overcoming hard losses.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it. Okay, before we let you go, I love the book. There is one thing I'm going to fight you on in the book.
Oh no.
I've been waiting for this the whole time. And that is Chumbawamba is not a one-hit wonder band. This is a hill I am willing to die on. I will fight this one to the death. It is the one issue I have with the entire book.
Uh, you know, I'm fine with you fighting me on that. I'll admit it. I relied on my middle school mind of hearing that song over and over and over again, and use that as an example because that's what I remember. But I will. You send me the evidence. You send me their other songs that I
I
haven't
will
heard.
send you a thesis.
Send it my way. I apologize for offending any Chumbawamba song.
You and the other
fans.
three Chumbawamba fans.
Yes.
They're a fantastic anarcho-punk band that happened to have a song that went mainstream, but they stayed true to their anarcho-punk like roots, released many albums before and after that, and are fantastic. Anyway, thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
I love it. I love it. And I enjoyed the song in middle school when I heard it. So I haven't heard their other
fantastic
stuff. So I'll go down a rabbit hole of listening.
I'm gonna send you like the essential playlist after this. All right. So before we let you go, tell us where everyone can find you, find the book, all that fun stuff.
Yep. So you can find me on basically any social, Twitter, X, Blue Sky, Instagram, YouTube at Steve Magness. It's very simple. SteveMagness.com. You can get the book basically anywhere, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local bookstore, all that good stuff. So I appreciate you guys listening and hope you'll check out the book.
Yeah, definitely highly recommend. I think it's such a good one for like anyone, not just athletes, obviously, but especially for the athletes who are, struggling with the figuring out who they are in sport, especially, for those of us who are not getting any younger in sport and maybe need to rethink how we approach things. So thank you so much, Steve. This has been awesome.
Thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.